Get over here. Why are you wet? Why are you always wet? Why did you do this? Bite? Hey, Eric. Now we're waiting for... Oh, I'm using my computer because my phone's too low on battery. So this doesn't let me invite people. So hopefully Steven will get here. Hey, buddy. You gonna purr into the microphone? Alright, Steven's here, so we can start. Steven's here, Eric's here, Louie's here. Alright. So, yeah, we left off. Yeah, I know. Louie's not. Louie's just here to distract me. So we've had a bit of a break, but last time where we left off was Kavath was still trying to get help his what's his name? Get. Now Louie's messing with the microphone. Oh god. He's trying to help why can't the mayor guy get this lady that he is interested in. So we'll see how that goes. So, chapter 68, The Cost of a Loaf. The days that followed were pleasant ones. My sunlight... Thank you, Louis. He is claiming that my book. I figured it wasn't just bite, but I just decided to say it that way, because for once I could actually almost pronounce something, or feel like I could. Louis is just rubbing and see, he's here to distract me. He's just rubbing his face against my book for some reason. My sunlight hours were spent with Denna in Severin Low, exploring the city and surrounding countryside. We spent time riding, swimming, singing, or simply talking the afternoons away. I flattered her outrageously and without hope, because only a fool would hope to catch her. Then I would return to my rooms and pen the letter that had been building inside me all day, or I would pour out a torrent of song to her. And in that letter, or song, I said all the things I hadn't dared to tell Denna during the day, things I knew would only frighten her away. After I finished the letter or the song, I would write it again. I would dull its edges a little, remove an honesty or two. I slowly smoothed and stitched it until it fit Malouin Lackless as snugly as a calfskin glove. It was idyllic. I had better luck finding Denna in Severin than I ever had in Imra. We met for hours at a stretch, sometimes more than once a day, sometimes 3 or 4 days in a row. Though in the interest of honesty, things were not perfect. There were a few burrs in the blanket, as my father used to say. The first was a young gentleman named Jared. I mean, of course it's not spelled like Jared. I'm trying. G-E-R-R-E-D. Jared, Garrett, I don't know. I'm just going to say Jared. A young gentleman named Jared who accompanied Denna on one of our early meetings down in Severin Low. He didn't know her as Denna, of course. He called her Alora. Oh, she's moving on to the A's again. She's circled all the way through the alphabet and she's back to A. He called her Alora, and so did I for the rest of the day. Jared's face held the doomed expression I had come to know very well. He had known Denna long enough to fall for her, and he was just beginning to realize his time was drawing to an end. I watched as he made the same mistakes I'd seen others make before him. He put his arm around her possessively. He gave her the gift of a ring. As we strolled the city, if her eye focused on anything for more than 3 seconds, he offered to buy it for her. He tried to pin her down with a promise of some future meeting. A dance at the De Ferrers man's, dinner at the Golden Board. The Tenpenny King was being performed tomorrow by Count Abelard's men. Individually, any of these things would have been fine, perhaps even charming, but taken together they showed themselves as pure, white-knuckled desperation. He clutched at Denna as if he were a drowning man and she a plank of wood. He glared at me when she wasn't watching, and when Denna bid the two of us goodbye that evening, his face was drawn and white as if he were already 2 days dead. The second burr was worse. After I'd been helping the mayor court his lady for almost 2 span, Denna disappeared. No trace or word of warning, no note of farewell or apology. I waited for 3 hours at the livery where we'd agreed to meet. After that, I went to her inn, only to find that she had left with all her things the night before. I went to the park where we had taken lunch the previous day, then to a dozen other places where we'd made a habit of each other's company. It was near midnight by the time I took the lifts back to the top of the sheer. Even then, some foolish part of me hoped she would greet me at the top, rushing into my arms again with her wild enthusiasm. But she wasn't there. That night I wrote no letter or song for Meluan. The second day I ghosted through Severin Low for hours, worried and wounded. Later that night in my rooms I sweated and cursed and crumpled my way through 20 sheets of paper before I arrived at 3 brief, half-tolerable paragraphs, which I gave to the mayor to do with as he wished. The third day my heart sat like a stone in my chest. I tried to finish the song I'd been writing for the mayor, but nothing worthwhile came of my efforts. For the first hour, the notes I played were leaden and lifeless. The second hour, they grew discordant and faltering. I pressed on until every sound my lute made grated like a knife against teeth. I finally let my poor, tortured lute fall silent, remembering something my father had said long ago. Songs choose their hour and their own season. When your tunes tin, there is a reason. The tone of a tune is your heart's metal, and there's no clear water from a muddy well. All you can do is let the silt settle, or you'll sound sour as a broken bell. I lowered my lute into its case, knowing the truth of it. I needed a few days before I could productively return to courting Meluan or on the mayor's behalf. The work was too delicate to force or fake. On the other hand, I knew the mayor would not be pleased with a delay. I needed a diversion, and since the mayor was too clever by half, it needed to be at least halfway legitimate. I heard the telltale sigh of air that signaled the mayor's secret passage opening in my dressing room. I made sure I was pacing anxiously by the time he came through the doorway. Alvaron had continued to put on weight in the last 2 span, and since his face was no longer hollow and drawn. His face was no longer hollow and drawn. He cut quite a figure in his finery, a creamy ivory shirt and stiff jacket of deep sapphire blue. "I got your message," he said brusquely. "Have you finished the song, then?" I turned to face him. "No, Your Grace. Something more important than the song has come to my attention." "As far as you are concerned, there is nothing more important than the song," the mayor said firmly, tugging the cuff of his shirt to straighten it. "I've heard from several people that Meluan was greatly pleased with the first 2. You should focus the whole of your efforts in that direction." "Your Grace, I am well aware that—" "Out with it," Alvaron said impatiently, glancing at the face of the tall gear clock that stood in the corner of the room. "I have appointments to keep. Your life is in further danger from Codicus." I'll give this to the mayor. He could have made his living on the stage. The only break in his composure was a brief hesitation as he tugged his other cuff into place. "And how is that?" he asked, apparently unconcerned. "There are ways for him to harm you other than poison, things that can be done from a distance." "A spell, you mean?" Alvaron said. "He means to conjure up a sending and set it to bedevil me?" Telu, anyway, spells and sendings. It was easy to forget this intelligent, subtle, and otherwise educated man was little better than a child when it came to arcane matters. He probably believed in fairies and the walking dead. Poor fool. However, attempting to re-educate him would be tiresome and counterproductive. "There is a chance of that, Your Grace, as well as other more direct threats." He dropped some of his unconcerned pose and looked at me in the eye. What could be more direct than a sending? The mayor was not the sort of man to be moved through words alone, so I picked up an apple from a bowl of fruit and polished it on my sleeve before handing it to him. "Would you hold this for a moment, Your Grace?" He took it suspiciously. "What's this about, then?" I walked over to where my lovely burgundy coat hung on the wall, and retrieved a needle from one of its many pockets. "I'm showing you the sort of thing Codicus is capable of, Your Grace." I held out the hand for the apple. He gave it back, and I looked it over. Holding it at an angle to the light, I saw what I'd hoped for, smudged onto the glossy skin of the apple. I muttered a binding, focused my alar, and pushed the needle into the center of the blurry imprint his forefinger had made on the apple's skin. Alvaron twitched and made an inarticulate noise of surprise, staring at his hand as if it had been unexpectedly, say, pricked with a pin. I'd half expected him to rebuke me, but he did nothing of the sort. His eyes went wide, his face pale. Then his expression grew thoughtful as he watched the bead of blood swell on the pad of his finger. He licked his lips and slowly put his finger into his mouth. "I see," he said quietly. "Such things can be guarded against?" It wasn't really a question. I nodded, keeping my expression grave. "Somewhat, Your Grace. I believe I can create a charm to protect you. I only regret I didn't think of this sooner. But with one thing and another... Yes, yes, the mayor waved me into silence. And what will you require for such a charm? It was a layered question. On the surface he was asking what materials I would need, but the mayor was a practical man. He was asking me my price as well. The workshop in Codicus's tower should have the equipment I need, Your Grace. What materials he doesn't have on hand I should be able to find in Severn given time. That is a very good time-saving idea, Eric. Codicus could cyberbully him. No, he's using basically a voodoo doll. Then I paused, considering the second portion of his question, thinking of the 100 things the mayor could grant me. Money enough to swim in, a newly crafted loot of the sort only kings could afford. I felt a shock run through me at the thought. An Entresser lute. I had never even seen one, but my father had. He'd played one once in Anilin, and sometimes when he'd had a cup of wine, he would talk about it, his hands making gentle shapes in the air. The mayor could arrange this sort of thing in the blink of an eye. All that and more, of course. Alvaron could arrange access to 100 private libraries. A formal patronage would be no small thing either, coming from him. The mayor's name would open doors as quickly as the king's. There are a few things, I said slowly, that I have been hoping to discuss with your grace. I have a project I need assistance to pursue properly. And I have a friend, a talented musician, who could use a well-placed patron. I trailed off meaningfully. Alvaron nodded, his gray eyes showing he understood. The mayor was no fool. He knew the cost of a loaf. I'll have Stapes get you the keys to Codicus's tower, he said. How long will this charm take to produce? I paused as if considering. At least 4 days, your grace. That would give me time for the muddy waters of my creative well to clear, or time for Denna to return from whatever errand he had pulled her suddenly away. If I was sure of his equipment, it could be sooner, but I will have to move carefully. I don't know what Codicus might have done to foul things before he fled. Alvaron frowned at this. Will you be able to continue your current projects as well? No, your grace. It will be rather exhausting and time-consuming, especially since I'm assuming you'd prefer I be circumspect while gathering my materials in Severn Low. Yes, of course. He exhaled hard through his nose. Damn and bother, things were going so well. Who can I bring in to write letters while you're occupied? He said the last musingly, mostly to himself. I needed to nip that thought in the bud. I did not want to share credit for Milowin's courtship with anyone. I don't think that will be necessary, your grace. 7 or 8 days ago, perhaps. But now, as you say, we have her interest. She is excited, eager for the next contact. If a few days pass with nothing from us, she will be disappointed. But more importantly, she will be anxious for the return of your attention. The mayor smoothed his beard with one hand, his expression pensive. I considered making a comparison to playing a fish on a line, but I doubted the mayor had ever engaged in anything so rustic as fishing. Not to presume, your grace, but in your younger days, did you ever attempt to win the affection of a young lady? Alvaron smiled at my careful phrasing. You may presume. Which did you find more interesting, the ones who leapt to your arms straight away, or those who were more difficult, reluctant, even indifferent to your pursuit? The mayor's eyes were far away with remembering. The same is true of women. Some cannot bear it when a man clings to them, and they all appreciate space to make their own choices. It's hard to long for something that is always there. Alvaron nodded. There is some truth in that. Absence feeds affection. He nodded more firmly. Very well. 3 days. He glanced at the gear clock again. And now I must be... One final thing, your grace, I said quickly. The charm I will make must be tuned specifically to you. It will require some of your cooperation. I cleared my throat. More precisely, some of your... I cleared my throat. Substance. Speak plainly. A small amount of blood, saliva, skin, hair, and urine. I sighed internally, knowing that to someone of the superstitious Vintic mindset, this would sound like a recipe for sending or some other equally ridiculous thing. As I'd expected, the mayor's eyes narrowed at the list. While I am no expert, he said slowly, those seem to be the very things I should avoid parting with. How can I trust you? I could have protested my loyalty, pointed out my past service, or brought his attention that I'd already saved his life, brought to his attention. But over the last month I'd come to know how the mayor's mind worked. I gave him my best knowing smile. You are an intelligent man, your grace. I'm sure you know the answer without my telling you. He returned my smile. Humor me, then. I shrugged. You're of no use to me if you're dead, your grace. His gray eyes searched mine for a moment. Then he nodded, satisfied. Very true. Send a message when you need those things. He turned to leave. 3 days. some water. Why do I have a notification from YouTube for The Late Show with Stephen Colbert? I'm not subscribed to that. I don't think. Anyway. Chapter 69. Such Madness. I made several trips to Severn Low to gather materials for Alveron's gram. Raw gold, nickel and iron, coal and etching acids. I acquired the money for these purchases by selling off various pieces of equipment from Codicus's workshop. I could have asked the mayor for money, but I'd rather he thought of me as independently resourceful rather than an ongoing financial drain. I'm just skipping so many words today. I'd grown so accustomed to finding her that now I caught glimpses of her when she wasn't there. Every day my hopeful heart rose at the sight of her turning a corner, stepping into a cobbler's, raising her hand to wave from across a courtyard. But it was never truly her, and I returned to the mayor's estate each evening more desolate than the day before. Making things worse was the fact that Braden had left Severn several days ago to visit some nearby relatives. I didn't realize how much I'd come to depend on him until he was gone. As I've already said, a gram is not particularly difficult to make if you have the proper equipment, a schema, and an alar like a blade of ramson steel. The metalworking tools in Codicus's tower were serviceable, though nowhere near— Hey! Stop! Stop that! My cat is being loud. Oh, here we go. Are you guys gonna start going crazy? I'm feeding them a little late. I really don't like that. Hi! You wanna come over here? Hey! Bagheera's showing up. He's not usually on camera. Okay. Hi! What's up? Okay, where was I? Oh, man. You made me lose my place. Hi. Okay, you're completely taken over now. Okay, cool. I'm just gonna be back here. Out of your way. Alright, crap. Okay, as I've already said, a gram is not particularly difficult to make if you have the proper equipment, a schema, and an alar like a blade of ramson steel. The metalworking tools in Codicus's tower were serviceable, though nowhere near as nice as those in the fishery. The schema was no difficulty either, as I have a good memory for such things. While I was working on the mayor's gram, I started a second one to replace the one I'd lost. Unfortunately, given the relatively crude nature of the equipment I was working with, I didn't have time to finish it properly. I finished the mayor's gram 3 days after talking to the mayor, 6 days after Denna's sudden disappearance. Oh, you know, the time change thing, I just heard that they're passing a bill to, like, make this daylight saving time change the last one we ever do. So we'll just stay on daylight saving time for always. So I hope that passes. Like, they're voting on the bill. I don't know. I don't think it passed yet. But I hope they do. I hate daylight saving time. That really messed me up this morning, too. Not my cats, but me. I woke up at, like, crazy late. Okay. Anyway, the following day I abandoned my pointless searching and planted myself in one of the open-air cafes where I drank coffee and tried to find inspiration for the song I owe the mayor. 10 hours I spent there, and the only active creation I accomplished was to magically transform nearly a gallon of coffee into marvelous aromatic piss. That night I drank an unwise amount of scutton and fell asleep at my writing desk. Mellowin's song was still unfinished. The mayor was less than pleased. Denna reappeared on the 7th day, as I wandered our haunts in Severn Low. Despite all my searching, she saw me first and ran laughing to my side, excited to tell me about a song she'd heard the day before. We spent the day together as easily as if she'd never left. I didn't ask her about her unexplained disappearance. I had known Denna for more than a year now, and I understood a few of the hidden turnings of her heart. It's only been a year? Wow. I knew she valued her privacy. I knew she had secrets. That night, we were in a small garden that ran along the very edge of the sheer. We sat on a wooden bench looking out over the dark city below. a messy splay of lamplight, streetlight, gaslight, with a few rare sharp points of sympathy light scattered throughout. "I am sorry, you know," she said softly. We'd been sitting quietly watching the lights of the city for nearly a quarter hour. If she was continuing some previous conversation, I couldn't remember what it was. "Beg pardon?" When Denna didn't say anything immediately, I turned to look at her. There was no moon, and the night was dark. Her face was dimly illuminated by 1,000 lights below. "Sometimes I leave," she said at last, "quick and quiet in the night." Denna didn't look at me as she spoke, keeping her dark eyes fixed on the city below. "It's what I do," she continued, her voice quiet. "I leave. No word or warning first. No explanation after. Sometimes it's the only thing that I can do." You're telling us this like we don't know. It won't matter, Stephen. Like, if it's always daylight saving time, then there's nothing ever to adjust to. You don't... Hi. I'm sure it makes sense. I'm not going to explain it right, but it makes sense. Cats are being so distracting. I don't understand. She turned to meet my eyes, then, her face serious in the dim light. I hope you know without my telling you," she said. "I hope I don't need to say it." Denna turned back to look at the glimmering lights below. "But for what it's worth, I am sorry." We sat for a while then, enjoying a comfortable silence. I wanted to say something. I wanted to say it didn't bother me, but that would be a lie. I wanted to tell her all that really mattered to me was that she came back, but I was worried that might be too much truth. So rather than risk saying the wrong thing, I said nothing. I knew what happened to the men who clung to her too tightly. That was the difference between me and the others. I did not clutch at her, try to own her. I did not slip my arm around her, murmur in her ear, or kiss her unsuspecting cheek. Certainly I thought of it. I still remembered the warmth of her when she had thrown her arms around me near the horse lift. There were times I would have given my right hand to hold her again. But then I thought of the faces of the other men when they realized Denna was leaving them. I thought of all the others who had tried to tie her to the ground and failed. So I resisted showing her the songs and poems I had written, knowing that too much truth can ruin a thing. And if that meant she wasn't entirely mine, what of it? I would be the one she could always return to without fear of recrimination or question. So I did not try to win her and contented myself with playing a beautiful game. But there was always a part of me that hoped for more, and so there was a part of me that was always a fool. Days passed, and Denna and I explored the streets of Severin. We lounged in cafes, attended plays, went riding. We climbed the face of the Sheer using the low road just to say we'd done it. We visited the dock markets, a traveling menagerie, and several curiosity cabinets. Some days we did nothing but sit and talk, and on those days nothing filled our conversations as much as music. We spent countless hours discussing the craft of it, how songs fit together, how chorus and verse play against each other, about tone and mode and meter. These were things I'd learned at an early age and thought about often, and though Denna was new to this study, in some ways that worked to her advantage. I'd learned about music since before I could talk. I knew 10,000 rules of melody and verse better than I knew the backs of my own hands. Denna didn't. In some ways this hampered her, but in other ways it made her music strange and marvelous. I'm doing a poor job of explaining this. Think of music as being a great snarl of a city, like Tarbean. In the years I spent living there, I came to know its streets. Not just the main streets, not just the alleys. I knew shortcuts and rooftops and parts of the sewers. Because of this, I could move through the city like a rabbit in a bramble. I was quick and cunning and clever. Denna, on the other hand, had never been trained. She knew nothing of shortcuts. You'd think she'd be forced to wander the city, lost and helpless, trapped in a twisting maze of mortared stone. But instead, she simply walked through the walls. She didn't know any better. Nobody had ever told her she couldn't. Because of this, she moved through the city like some fairy creature. She walked roads no one else could see, and it made her music wild and strange and free. In the end, it took 23 letters, 6 songs, and, though it shames me to say it, 1 poem. There was more to it than that, of course. Letters alone cannot win a woman's heart. Alvaron did a fair piece of his own courting, and after he revealed himself as Meloen's anonymous suitor, he did the lion's share of the work, slowly wooing Meloen to his side with the gentle reverence he felt for her. But my letters caught her attention. My songs brought her close enough for Alvaron to work his slow, garrulous charm. Even so, I can take only a small piece of credit for the letters and songs. And as for the poem, there is only one thing in the world that could move me to such madness. So you can't see it, but both of my cats are here. This one's Bagheera, and Louie's just right below the frame here. And he's looking at me like, why are you touching my face? Maybe you can kind of... Can I get you in there? Yeah. Anyway. Chapter 70. Clinging. I met Denna outside her inn on Chalkers Lane, a little place I called the Four Tapers. As I turned the corner and saw her standing in the light cast by a lantern hanging above the front door, I felt an upwelling of joy at the simple pleasure of being able to find her when I went looking. "I got your note," I said. Imagine my delight. Denna smiled and made a one-handed curtsy. She was wearing a skirt, not a complicated dress of the sort a noblewoman would wear, but a simple sweep of fabric you could wear while bucking hay or going to a barn dance. "I wasn't sure you would be able to make it," she said, "it being past the hour most civilized folk have taken to their beds." "I'll admit I was surprised," I said. "If I was the sort of man to pry, I would wonder what kept you occupied until this most unseemly hour." "Business," she said with a dramatic sigh. "A meeting with my patron." "He's in town again?" I asked. She nodded. "And he wanted to meet you at midnight?" I asked. "That's odd." Dennis stepped out from under the inn's sign, and we began to walk down the street together. "The hand that holds the purse," she said, giving a helpless shrug. "Odd times and inconvenient places are the rule with Master Ash. Some part of me suspects he might simply be some lonely noble, bored with ordinary patronage. I wonder if it adds some spice for him, pretending he's meshed in some dark intrigue instead of just commissioning some songs from me." "So what do you have planned for tonight?" I asked. "Only to pass time in your lovely company," Dennis said, reaching out and linking her arm with mine. "In that case," I said, "I have something to show you. It's a surprise. You'll have to trust me." "I've heard each of those a dozen times." Denna's dark eyes glittered wickedly. "But never all together, and never from you," she smiled. "I'll give you the benefit of the doubt, and we'll save my world-weary jibes for later. Take me where you will." So we made our way to Severn Hythe by way of the horse lifts, where we both gawked at the lights of the nighttime city below like low-born cretins we were. I took her on a long stroll through the cobblestone streets, past shops and small gardens. Then we left the buildings behind, climbed over a low wooden fence, and moved toward the dark shape of an empty barn. At this, Denna was no longer able to keep quiet. "Well, you've done it," she said. "You've surprised me." I grinned at her and continued to lead the way into the dark of the barn. It was full of the smell of hay and absent animals. I led her to a ladder that disappeared into the dark above our heads. "A hayloft?" she demanded, her voice incredulous. She stopped walking and gave me an odd, curious look. "You obviously have me mistaken for a 14-year-old farm girl named—" Her mouth worked soundlessly for a moment. "Something rustic." "Greta?" I suggested. "Yes," she said. "You obviously have me mistaken for a low-bodiced farm girl named Greta." "Rest assured," I said, "if I were going to try to seduce you, this isn't the way I would go about it." "Is that so?" she said, running her hand through her hair. Her fingers began to idly twine her hair into a braid, then she stopped and brushed it out. "In that case, what are we doing here?" "You mentioned how much you enjoyed gardens," I said, "and Alveron's gardens are particularly fine. I thought you might enjoy a turn about the place." "In the middle of the night," Dennis said. "A charming moonlit stroll," I corrected. "There's no moon tonight," she pointed out. "Or if there is, it's barely a slender sliver. Barely a slender sliver. That's hard to say." Yeah, the cats are providing... Yeah, that's Baloo. He's being a baby. You're providing some good ambient background noise. Thanks for that. "Be that as it may," I said, refusing to be daunted. "How much moonlight does one actually need to enjoy the smell of gently blooming jasmine?" "In the hayloft," Dennis said, her voice thick with disbelief. "Thence into the mayor's estates. Thence to the garden." "Oh wait, sorry. I skipped a line. The hayloft is the easiest way onto the roof," I said. "Thence into the mayor's estates, thence to the garden." "If you're in the mayor's employ," she said, "why not simply ask him to let you in?" "Ah," I said dramatically, holding up a finger. "Therein lies the adventure. There are 100 men who could simply take you strolling in the mayor's gardens, but there is only one who can sneak you in." I smiled at her. "What I'm offering you, Denna, is a singular opportunity." She grinned at me. "You know my secret heart so well." I extended my hand as if I were about to assist her into a carriage. "M'lady." Denna took my hand, then stopped as soon as she put her foot onto the first rung of the ladder. Hold on, you aren't being genteel. You're trying to get a look up my dress. And now I'm getting flashbacks from Resident Evil. Yeah, I'm surprised it took her that long to think of a name, honestly. She seems so good at coming up with names. Hey, hey, hey. You're gonna mess things up over there. Don't step on that. Okay. I gave her my best offended look, pressing my hand to my chest. Lady, as a gentleman, I assure you. She swatted at me. You've already told me you're not a gentleman, she said. You're a thief, and you're trying to steal a look. She stepped back and made a parody of my courtly gesture a moment before. M'lord. We made our way through the hayloft, onto the roof, and into the garden. The sharp sliver of moon above us was thin as a whisper, so pale that it did nothing to dim the light of the stars. The gardens were surprisingly quiet for such a warm and lovely night. Ordinarily, even at this late hour, couples would be strolling the paths or murmuring to each other on the bower benches. Now what are you doing? These cats are on crack right now. I wondered if some ball or courtly function had pulled them all away. The mayor's gardens were vast, with curving paths and cunningly placed hedges making them seem larger still. Denna and I walked side by side, listening to the sigh of the wind through the leaves. It was like we were the only people in the world. I don't know if you remember, I said softly, not wanting to intrude upon the silence. A conversation we had some time ago. We talked of flowers. I remember, she said, just as softly. You said you thought all men had got their lessons in courting from the same worn book. Denna laughed quietly, more emotion than a sound. She put her hand to her mouth. Oh, I'd forgotten. I did say that, didn't I? I nodded. You said they all brought you roses. They still do, she said. I wish they would find a new book. You made me pick a flower that would suit you better, I said. She smiled up at me shyly. I remember I was testing you. Then she frowned. But you got the better of me by picking one I'd never heard of, let alone seen. We turned a corner and the path led toward the dark green tunnel of an arching bower. I don't know if you've seen them yet, I said, but here is your Celas flower. There were only stars lighting our way, the moon so slender it was almost no moon at all. Under the trellis it was dark as Denna's hair. Our eyes were wide and stretching to the dark, and where the starlight slanted through the leaves, they showed hundreds of Celas blossoms yawning open in the night. If the scent of Celas were not so delicate, it would have been overpowering. Oh, Denna sighed, looking around with wide eyes. Under the bower, her skin was brighter than the moon. She reached out her hands to both sides. They're so soft! We walked in silence. All around us, Celas vines wove themselves around the trellis, clinging to the wood and wire, hiding their faces from the nighttime sky. When eventually we came out the other side, it seemed as bright as daylight. The silence stretched until I started to grow uncomfortable. So now you know your flower, I said. It seemed a shame you'd never seen one. They're rather difficult to cultivate, from what I've heard. Perhaps they do suit me, then, Denna said softly, looking down. I don't take root easily. We continued walking until the path turned and hid the bower behind us. You treat me better than I deserve, Denna said at last. I laughed at the ridiculousness of that. Only respect for the silence of the garden kept it from rolling out of me in a great booming laugh. Instead, I stifled it as much as possible, though the effort threw me off my stride and made me stumble. Denna watched me from a step away, a smile spreading across her mouth. Eventually I caught my breath. You who sang with me the night I won my pipes, you who have given me the finest gift I ever did receive, a thought occurred to me. Did you know, I said, that your lute case saved my life? The smile spread and grew, wide as a flower. Did it now? It did, I said. I cannot ever hope to treat you as well as you deserve. Given what I owe you, this is but the smallest payment. Well, I think it is a lovely start. She looked up at the sky and drew a long, deep breath. I've always liked moonless nights best. It's easier to say things in the dark. It's easier to be yourself. She began walking again, and I fell into step beside her. We passed a fountain, a pool, a wall of pale jasmine open to the night. We crossed a small stone bridge that led us back among the shelter of the hedges. You could put your arm around me, you know, she said matter-of-factly. We are walking in the gardens, alone, in the moonlight such as it is. Denna looked sideways at me, the side of her mouth quirking upward. Such things are permitted, you realize. Her sudden change in manner caught me off my guard. Since we had met in Severin, I had courted her with wild, hopeless pageantry, and she had matched me without missing a beat. Each flattery, each witticism, each piece of playful banter she returned to me, not in an echo, but a harmony. Our back and forth had been like a duet. But this was different. Her tone was less playful and more plain. It was so sudden a change that I was at a loss for words. 4 days ago I turned my foot on that loose flagstone, she said softly. Remember? We were walking on Mincet Lane. My foot slipped and you caught me almost before I knew that I was stumbling. It made me wonder how closely you must be watching me to see something like that. We turned a corner in the path, and Denna continued to speak without looking up at me. Her voice was soft and musing, almost as if she were talking to herself. You had your hands on me then, sure as anything, steadying me. You almost had your arm around me. It would have been so easy for you then. A matter of inches. But when I got my feet beneath me, you took your hands away. No hesitation, no lingering. Nothing I might take amiss. She started to turn her face to me, then stopped and looked down again. It's quite a thing, she said. There are so many men, all endlessly attempting to sweep me off my feet, and there is one of you, trying just the opposite, making sure my feet are firm beneath me, lest I fall. Almost shyly, she reached out. When I moved to take your arm, you accept it easily. You even lay your hand on mine as if to keep it there. She explained my movement exactly as I was making it, and I fought to keep the gesture from becoming suddenly awkward. But that's all. You never presume. You never push. Do you know how strange that is to me? We looked at each other for a moment there in the silent moonlit garden. I could feel the heat of her standing close to me, her hand clinging to my arm. Inexperienced as I was with women, even I could read this cue. I tried to think of what to say, but I could only wonder at her lips. How could they be so red as this? Even the Celas was dark in the faint moonlight. How were her lips so red? Then Denna froze. Not that we were moving much, but in a moment she went from motionless to still, cocking her head like a deer straining to catch a half-heard sound. Someone's coming, she said. Come on. Clinging to my arm, she pulled me off the path, over a stone bench, and through a low, narrow gap in the hedges. We finally came to rest in the center of some thick bushes. There was a convenient hollow where we both had room to crouch. Thanks to the work of the gardeners, there was no undergrowth to speak of, no dry leaves or twigs to crackle or snap under our hands and knees. In fact, the grass in this sheltered place was thick and soft as any lawn. There are 1,000 girls who could walk with you along the moonlit garden paths, Denna said breathlessly. But there's only one who'll hide in the shrubbery with you. She grinned at me, her voice bubbling with amusement. Denna peered out of the hedge toward the path, and I looked at her. Her hair fell like a curtain down the side of her head, and the tip of her ear was peeking out through it. It was at that moment the most lovely thing that I had ever seen. Then I heard the faint grit of footsteps on the path. The soft sound of voices came sifting through the hedge, a man and a woman. After a moment they came walking around the corner, arm in arm. I recognized them immediately. I turned and leaned close, breathing softly into Denna's ear. That's the mayor, I said, and his young lady-love. Denna shivered, and I shrugged out my burgundy cloak, draping it over her shoulders. I peered back out at the two of them. As I watched, Miloan laughed at something he said and rested her hand atop his on her arm. I doubted he'd have much more need of my services if they were already on such familiar terms as that. Not for you, my dear, I heard the mayor say clearly as they passed near us. You shall have nothing but roses. Denna turned to look at me, her eyes wide. She pressed both her hands against her mouth to stifle her laughter. In another moment they were past us, strolling slowly along, walking in step. Denna removed her hands and took several deep, shuddering breaths. He has a copy of the same worn book, she said, her eyes dancing. I couldn't help but smile. Apparently. So that's the mayor, she said quietly, her dark eyes peering between the leaves. He's shorter than I imagined. Would you like to meet him? I asked. I could introduce you. Oh, that would be lovely, she said with a gentle edge of mockery. She chuckled, but when I didn't join her laughter, she looked up at me and stopped. You're serious? She cocked her head to one side, her expression trapped between amusement and confusion. We probably shouldn't burst out of the hedge at him, I admitted, but we could come out on the other side and loop around to meet him. I gestured with my hand at the route we could take. I'm not saying he'll invite us to dinner or anything, but we can make a polite nod as we pass him on the path. Denna continued to stare at me, her eyebrows furrowing in the faint beginning of a frown. You're serious, she repeated. What do you... I stopped as I realized what her expression meant. You thought I was lying about working for the mayor, I said. You thought I was lying about being able to invite you in here. Men tell stories, she said dismissively. They like to brag a bit. I didn't think any less of you for telling me a bit of a tall tale. I wouldn't lie to you, I said, then reconsidered. No, that's not the truth. I would. You're worth lying for. But I wasn't. You're worth telling the truth for, too. Denna gave me a fond smile. That's harder to come by anyway. So, would you like to? I asked. Meet him, I mean? She looked out of the hedge toward the path. No. When she shook her head, her hair moved like drifting shadows. I believe you. There's no need. She looked down. Besides, I've got grass stains on my dress. What would he think? I've got leaves in my hair, I admitted. I know exactly what he would think. We stepped out from the... Well, it's not like you can't get rid of leaves in your hair. We stepped out from the hedge. I picked the leaves out of my hair, and Denna brushed her hands down the front of her skirt, wincing a bit as she moved over the grass stains. We made our way back onto the path and started walking again. I just saw that. Kvothe, help me! We made our way back onto the path and started walking again. I thought of putting my arm around her, but didn't. I was no good judge of these things, but it seemed the moment had passed. Denna looked up as we passed the statue of a woman picking a flower. She sighed. It was more exciting when I didn't know I had permission, she admitted with a little regret in her voice. It always is, I agreed. Alright, looks like this next one's very short. Yeah. We get some water. Chapter 71. Interlude. The Thrice Locked Chest. Kvothe raised his hand, motioning Chronicler to stop. The scribe wiped the nib of his pen on a nearby cloth and rolled his shoulders stiffly. Wordlessly, Kvothe brought out a worn deck of cards and began to deal them around the table. Bast picked up his cards and looked them over curiously. Chronicler frowned. What? Footsteps sounded on the wooden landing outside, and the door of the Waystone Inn opened, revealing a bald, thick-bodied man wearing an embroidered jacket. Mayor Land, the innkeeper said, putting down his cards and getting to his feet. What can I do for you? A drink? A bite to eat? A glass of wine would be quite welcome, the mayor said as he moved into the room. Do you have any red Grimsby in? The innkeeper shook his head. I'm afraid not, he said. The roads, you know. It's hard to keep things in stock. The mayor nodded. I'll take anything red, then, he said. But I won't pay more than a penny for it, mind you. Of course not, sir, the innkeeper said solicitously, wringing his hands a bit. Anything to eat? No, the bald man said. I'm actually here to make use of the scribe. I thought I'd wait until things quieted down a bit so we could have some privacy. He looked around the empty room. I don't imagine you'd mind borrowing the place for half an hour, would you? Mind my borrowing the place, he said. Yeah, that's not confusing at all. Not at all, the innkeeper smiled ingratiatingly. He made a shooing motion to Bast. But I had a full board, Bast protested, waving his cards. The innkeeper frowned at his assistant, then headed back into the kitchen. The mayor removed his jacket and laid it across the back of a chair while Bast gathered up the rest of the cards, grumbling. No, you stayed there. Thank you. The innkeeper brought out a glass of red wine, then locked the front door with a large brass key. I'll take the boys upstairs with me, he said to the mayor, to give you some privacy. That's exceedingly kind of you, the mayor said as he sat across from the chronicler. I'll give a shout when I'm finished. The innkeeper nodded and herded Bast out of the common room and up the stairs. Kvothe opened the door to his room and gestured Bast inside. Get down! Hey! Oh, you little jerk. Come here, come here. Stop being a little brat. I wonder what old Lant wants to keep secret, Kvothe said as soon as the door was closed behind them. I hope he's not too long about it. He's got 2 children by the widow Creel, Bast said, matter-of-factly. Kvothe raised an eyebrow at that. Really? Bast shrugged. Everyone in town knows. Kvothe humphed at this as he settled down into a large upholstered chair. What are we going to do with ourselves for half an hour? He asked. It's been ages since we've had lessons. Bast pulled a wooden chair away from the small desk and sat on the edge of it. You could teach me something. Lessons, Kvothe mused. You could read Selim Tentura. Reshi, Bast said imploringly, it's so boring. I don't mind lessons, but do they need to be book lessons? Bast's tone wrung a smile from Kvothe. A puzzle lesson, then. Bast's face broke into a grin. Very well, let me think for a second. He tapped his fingers against his lips and let his eyes wander the room. It wasn't long before they were drawn to the foot of the bed where the dark chest lay. He made a casual gesture. How would you open my chest if you had a mind to? Bast's expression grew slightly apprehensive. Your thrice-locked chest, Reshi? Kvothe looked at his student, then laughter bubbled out of him. My what? he asked incredulously. Bast blushed and looked down. That's just how I think of it, he mumbled. As names go, Kvothe hesitated, a smile playing around his mouth. Well, it's a little storybook, don't you think? You're the one who made the thing, Reshi. Bast said sullenly. 3 locks and fancy wood and all that. It's not my fault if it sounds storybook. Kvothe leaned forward and rested an apologetic hand on Bast's knee. It's a fine name, Bast. Just caught me off my guard is all. He leaned back again. So, how would you attempt to plunder the thrice-locked chest of Kvothe the Bloodless? Bast smiled. You sound like a pirate when you say it that way, Reshi. He gave the chest a speculative look from across the room. I suppose asking you for the keys is out of the question, he asked at last. Correct, Kvothe said. For our purposes, assume I have lost the keys. Better yet, assume I am dead, and you are now free to pry into all my secret things. That's a little grim, Reshi, Bast reproached gently. Life is a little grim, Bast, Kvothe said without any hint of laughter in his voice. You'd best start getting used to it. He waved a hand toward the chest. Go on, I'm curious to see how you go about cracking this little chestnut. Bast gave him a flat look. Puns are worse than book lessons, Reshi, he said, walking over to the chest. He nudged it idly with his foot, then bent and looked at the 2 separate lock plates, one dark iron, the other bright copper. Bast prodded the round lid with a finger, wrinkling his nose. I can't say as I care for this wood, Reshi, and the iron lock is positively unfair. What a useful lesson this has already been, Kvothe said dryly. You've deduced a universal truth. Things are unusually unfair. There aren't any hinges either, Bast exclaimed, looking at the back of the chest. How can you have a lid without any hinges? That did take me a while to work out, Kvothe admitted with a touch of pride. Bast got down on his hands and knees and looked into the copper keyhole. He lifted one hand and pressed it flat against the copper plate. Then he closed his eyes and went very still, as if he were listening. After a moment of this, he leaned forward and breathed against the lock. When nothing happened, his mouth began to move. While his words were spoken too softly to hear, they carried an undeniable tone of entreaty. After a long moment of this, Bast sat back on his haunches, frowning. Then he grinned playfully, reaching out with a hand, and knocked on the lid of the chest. It made barely any noise at all, as if he were rapping his knuckle against a stone. Out of curiosity, Kvothe asked, what would you do if something knocked back? Bast came to his feet, left the room, and returned a moment later with an assortment of tools. He got to one knee and, using a piece of bent wire, fiddled with the copper lock for several long minutes. Eventually he began to curse under his breath. When he shifted position to get a different angle, his hand brushed the dull iron faceplate of the lock, and he jerked back, hissing and spitting. Getting back to his feet, Bast threw down the wire and brought out a long pry bar of bright metal. He tried to work the thin end of it under the lid, but couldn't gain any purchase in the hair-thin seam. After a few minutes he abandoned this as well. Next, Bast tried to tip the chest on its side to examine the bottom, but his best efforts only managed to slide it an inch or so across the floor. How much does this weigh, Reshi? Bast exclaimed, looking rather exasperated. 300 pounds? Over 400 when it's empty, Kvothe said. Remember the trouble we had getting it up the stairs? Sighing, Bast examined the chest for another long moment, his expression fierce. Then he extracted a hatchet from his bundle of tools. It wasn't the rough, wedge-headed hatchet they used to cut kindling behind the inn. It was slender and menacing, all forged of a single piece of metal. The shape of its blade was vaguely reminiscent of a leaf. He tossed the weapon lightly in his palm, as if testing its weight. This is where I would go next, Reshi, if I were genuinely interested in getting inside. He gave his teacher a curious look. But if you'd rather I not. Kvothe made a helpless gesture. Don't look at me, Bast. I'm dead. Do as you will. Bast grinned and brought the hatchet down on the rounded peak of the chest. There was a strange, soft ringing noise, like a padded bell being struck in a distant room. Bast paused, then rained a flurry of angry blows down on the top of the chest, first swinging wildly with one hand, then using both hands in great overhand chopping motions as if he were splitting wood. The bright leaf-shaped blade refused to bite into the wood, each blow turning aside as if Bast were attempting to chop apart a great, seamless block of stone. Eventually Bast stopped, breathing hard, and bent to look at the top of the chest, running his hand over the surface before turning his attention to the hatchet's blade. He sighed. You do good work, Reshi. Kvothe smiled and tipped an imaginary hat. Bast gave the chest a long look. I'd try to set fire to it, but I know Roa doesn't burn. I'd have better luck getting it hot enough so the copper lock would melt, but to do that I'd need to get the whole thing to sit face down in a forge fire. He looked at the chest, large as a gentleman's traveling trunk. But it would have to be a bigger forge than the one we have here in town, and I don't even know how hot copper needs to be in order to melt. Information such as that, Kvoth said, would doubtless be the subject of a book lesson. And I suspect you've been taking precautions against that sort of thing. I have, Kvoth admitted, but it was a good idea. It shows lateral thinking. And acid? Bast said. I know we have some potent stuff downstairs. Formic is useless against Ro, Kvoth said, as is the muriatic. You might have some luck with Aqua Regis, but the wood is quite thick, and we don't have much on hand. I wasn't thinking of the wood, Reshi. I was thinking of the locks again. With enough acid, I could eat clean through them. You're assuming they are copper and iron all the way through, Kvoth said. Even if they were, it would take a great deal of acid, and you would have to worry about the acid itself spilling into the chest, ruining whatever's inside. The same is true with the fire, of course. Bast looked at the chest for another long moment, stroking his lips thoughtfully. That's all I have, Reshi. I'll need to think on it some more. Kvoth nodded. Looking somewhat disheartened, Bast gathered up his tools and carried them away. When he returned, he pushed the chest from the other side, sliding it back a fraction of an inch until it was square with the foot of the bed again. It was a good attempt, Bast, Kvoth reassured him. Very methodical. You went about it just as I would have. Hello? The mayor's voice came hollowly from the room below. Up from the room below. I'm finished. Bast hopped up and hurried to the door, pushing his chair back under the desk. The sudden motion disturbed one of the crumpled sheets of paper resting there, causing it to tumble to the floor, where it bounced and rolled beneath the chair. Bast paused, then bent to pick it up. No, Kvoth said grimly. Leave it. Bast stopped with his hand outstretched, then stood and left the room. Kvoth followed, closing the door behind them. Let's see. How long is this next chapter? It's like, not short, but not too long. So, that was a little disappointing because I thought we were gonna see what was going on downstairs, and that felt like what was going on upstairs was not nearly as interesting as what was probably happening downstairs. I want to know what the mayor wanted. Let me see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6. I'm trying to decide whether I should go for one more, but it's like just long enough that I feel like it's gonna be, because it's been almost an hour now already, and my voice isn't doing so well, and I know, Eric, you have to get up early, so I'll probably just stop it here for tonight, and then continue next time. So anyway, yeah, I'll stop it here. But thanks, guys, for watching, and we'll figure out the next day to do this. And my cats are going crazy, so I have to feed them. So I'll say goodnight, and I'll see you guys later. All right, bye.